Okay. All right, I'm going to go ahead and teach it just to everybody here. If somebody joins, then they join. So residential purchase agreement. It's probably the most zip form you're ever going to deal with in your career. And I'm going to go right to it because it's a lot to cover. Okay, I want to share a screen. There we go. Okay, so here we go. There's a lot of other forms that are attached to the purchase agreement, but because there's so much to cover in this, I'm not going to go over those right now. So this is strictly about the purchase agreement. The very first thing that you should fill out is the date prepared. It's really important. It's not the date that it's accepted. It's not the date that you necessarily send it to somebody to sign. It's the date you prepare it, because this date will be reflected on other forms moving forward. This is an offer from the buyer. The property is, this is the address, in what city, in what county, and the zip code, and then the parcel number. Where do you get the parcel number? Most likely you're going to find that on the MLS, because if it's a listing that's on the MLS, the parcel number is going to be reflected there. If not, you can search in Realist, which is a tax public records tax information. You could search that by the address, but it's called the parcel number, the assessor's parcel number, and you put that there. The terms of the purchase are specified below. The first thing that you need to get out is this thing called agency. The very first form that's bundled with this is called the agency disclosure, and it's a law by statute that you need to have two things by law. You have to disclose to your client what agency is. Like there's a buyer's agent who represents just buyers, or there's a seller's agent that represents just sellers, or there is a dual agent. So that's the first part of the law, is you have to explain to the buyer or the seller what agency is. The second part of the law is agency confirmation, and that's who is representing who. So the contracts are, and when we're talking agency, we're not talking individual agents, we are talking about the brokerage. So even though you might be representing the buyer and you might be representing the seller, you're both part of this brokerage, so it still would be dual agency. So it's the brokerage. Now, I'm the broker for 4 offices: West Side, Studio City, Larchmont, and Calabasas. If the deal was with an agent from Studio City, unfortunately, it is not dual agency, because that office has a different DRE number. It's all about the DRE number. If the corporation has a separate DRE number, it is not the same brokerage. And I say unfortunately because if it was, then everybody could exclude listings and could share those listings with those other offices, like Compass does. Compass has one brokerage, one corporation number, one broker, and through the whole state, and they keep their listings off the MLS for 2 weeks and sell it double-ended. So that's their strategy. We unfortunately can't do that. So here's the confirmation. Who's representing the seller? What brokerage is representing the seller? You need to fill that out, and the license number, the seller's agent and their license number, and the buyer's brokerage firm and their license phone number, and the buyer's agent. Get this wrong and you have to redo it on a separate form because it's the law. So if you don't fill this out, it really needs to be filled out correctly because it's the law. So there's a checkbox here. More than one brokerage represents the buyer or the seller. So if somebody from the agency next door is also representing the buyer or the seller, that would be an additional brokerage acknowledgement would need to be filed. So that says that there is an additional brokerage. Yeah, another form that's bundled with this is potential competing buyers and sellers. And the possible representation of more than one buyer and seller. It's basically saying to the buyer or the seller, look, I represent other buyers, I represent other sellers. So I may be representing somebody who is competing with you on this property. So that's basically all that form does. It's just disclosing to them that I may also be representing somebody competing with you. You're not my only client. So that's that. So item 3, these are the terms and the allocation of costs. You're going to see when people refer to items on this page, they will say item 3A or item 3D2. So that's how that first column is the item number and letter. The second column there, it says paragraph number. And what that's telling you is that there is a paragraph in this document, further into this document. If you want more information about this, go to paragraph 5 or 5B. So, so it's just a reference point. So don't get confused by that second column. So the very first thing is, how much is somebody going to pay for this? And is it all cash? Next, close of escrow. Are you doing it by days? Or are you doing it by a specific date? Now, here in Los Angeles, there's a lot of production people who are buying things. I represented a buyer when, you know, she would work 8 weeks and then be off, and then her next job would start and she'd work another 8 weeks. And we had to time when she closed with when she was working, because if they wanted to verify the employment, she had to be working when they were verifying the employment. So you can put in a specific date, or if a specific date is important to either the buyer or the seller. For example, a seller, if they're selling their property earlier than two years, they want to hit that two-year mark so it can be considered primary residence. Primary residence is if a seller has lived in the residence 2 out of the last 5 years. So if they're selling, if they're in a year and 8 months, they would want to delay that in order to avoid capital gains. They want to close after we hit the 2-year mark. So so that's just an example, or like I said, the buyer who has to close at a specific time. Expiration of offer. It defaults that this offer expires 3 calendar days after all buyers' signatures. All buyers' signatures. So if you only have one, you don't count it until everybody is signed. So at 5 o'clock. Now that can be changed. If you're in a multiple offer situation and hey, you think you have the best offer and you want to commit the seller to it, it's right now it's a buyer's market. So they say you can shorten that. So but it defaults to 3 days. Initial deposit amount. Now we always want to see 3% of the purchase price. And I will explain that with something that's coming up later. But 3% of the purchase price is the initial dollar amount, deposit amount. So and this is the only place in this, where are you? There we go. This is the only place in this contract that works on business days. Within 3 business days after acceptance, and it defaults to wiring to escrow. So everything else is calendar days. This is the only thing that is business days. And no, Saturday is not a business day for banks because some banks are open. It doesn't count as a business day. So that is the initial deposit. Then there's something called increased deposit. You're very rarely going to see an increased deposit. What would an example of an increased deposit is? Okay, I'm going to put $5,000 down now, and then when my inspection is done, or when the seller gets if they're doing a certificate of occupancy that they don't have yet on an ADU, when they get that, some action is happening, and after that action, you're then going to increase your deposit. So that's an example. Those are examples of increased deposits. So I'm putting so much down to solidify this deal, or to get it going, but then something's going to happen, and then I'm going to put more down. Yeah.
I've had instances where, because there were delays on the lending side, they said, okay, fine, we'll let you go another week or few days or whatever if you give us more deposit.
Right. Yes, there you go. There you go. Thank you, Cindy. Okay, and then the loan amount. How much are you going to borrow? So are they putting 5% down and then borrowing 95%? So you got to figure that amount out. And is it a conventional? It defaults to conventional loan, but then if there are other options, an FHA, a VA, seller financing. So that's what you would put in there. So oh, they are? Oh. Is he in the? I don't see anybody in the waiting room. That's the problem. There's something wrong with this Zoom that I don't see anybody waiting.
Wow, weird.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not, because there's
It's kind of weird that nobody's doing it.
right, exactly. That was my point, is that
To Angie earlier, and she was kind of doing it too, so it's weird to me that she didn't.
where are you? Yeah, I don't see anybody waiting. There's nobody waiting, so I don't know what happened here. If it's because I'm doing it here, I don't know. I don't know. Anyways,
Okay.
I unfortunately just let everybody know that I'm recording it, and then it'll be available.
Sounds good.
So,
Okay.
yeah. All right, so. We were talking about loan amounts. So always fill this in. Is it a fixed rate? Not to exceed, put a cap on it, like I think I heard this morning that interest rates were at 6.8 maybe now. 6.8, yeah. So put a cap, maybe 7, you know. Why put a cap on it? Because if you don't, then your buyer doesn't, if it goes from 6, like what, Cindy, last week, was it 5? What was it last week? It was still in 6s. I know, I don't know why there's no. I'm recording it, they can get it after I record it. I don't know why I don't see anybody waiting, so I don't.
Okay,
But they're not, I mean, there's nobody there.
okay.
I don't know if it's because I signed in here. But I signed into my account, so I don't understand why they're not showing up.
Because it says that when they click on one link that you sent out, says they're waiting in your personal waiting room, but you have another meeting in progress. And then another link is asking for a passcode to get it.
Oh, I don't know.
Okay.
I'm recording it, so you know, I'm sorry. Anyway, so say last week it was 6. Now it's 6.8. So that's a big jump. So if when it was 6, you had put a cap at 6.25 and it went to 6.8, then your buyer has an act. Your buyer can say, I put a cap on this, that I will only go up to 6.25. And so since it's not that right now, so I'm going to cancel. And they have every right to do that. But so many times I see where somebody hasn't done that and they have no right to cancel. So just because the interest rate went up, just because they don't want to pay more money. So that's the issue. Yes. Okay. Okay. So always put a cap on that. The next additional financing, if there's a second, we don't see seconds that often. I mean, we used to always, you know, like see a first and a second. So anyways, occupancy type, primary, if it defaults to primary, then secondary, and then investment. Secondary means a second home. Investment obviously is an investment. So this, when you put all these numbers in, it will calculate what the balance of the down payment is and what the total purchase price will reflect what you put in up here as to purchase price. So before we move on to the next page, anybody have any questions? No? Okay. So next, seller credit to the buyer. If the buyer up front says, I want the seller to credit me, you know, X amount of dollars towards closing costs, then that's where you would ask for it right here. Always have a great relationship with your lender, because there are limits to what the lender will allow. They're also, going back to close of escrow, if you're shortening that time to, you know, less than 30 days, I would definitely check with the lender, making sure that they can do that, you know, if they can honor that. So additional financing terms, what would you put here? Additional financing terms. I'm trying to remember. I used to have a great example, but I can't think of it right now because this stupid blinking screen is just distracting me. I'll think of something and I'll go back to it. Okay, this next one, 3G3 is tripping everybody up since they added it in December.
Oh,
Seller agrees to pay the obligation of buyer to compensate buyer's broker under separate agreement, seller's broker offer if any to compensate. Okay. You only use this item here if one, you have a buyer's broker's agreement. That's one. And what a buyer broker agreement says is that I'm representing you as the buyer, I'm representing you as your agent, Mr. Buyer, and you agree to pay me X amount of compensation, 2.5%, 3%, whatever you negotiate with that buyer, you buyer at the close of escrow are going to pay me for my time, and you're going to pay me this percentage. But it also says in that buyer broker agreement that if the seller is paying compensation to the buyer's agent, which is what usually happens, that there is an offer of compensation in the MLS of a certain percentage that the seller will pay at close of escrow. So if the seller is paying me 2.5%, then that amount is deducted from the amount that you're owing me. So if you agree to pay me 2.5% and the seller's paying 2.5%, buyer, you don't owe me anything. Okay. But if you negotiate with the buyer to pay 3% and the seller's only paying 2.5%, that's where this comes in. And only that's where this comes in, is that Mr. Seller, the buyer is paying me 3%, you're paying me 2.5%, because there's another form that you have to add to this, and that's exactly what it's saying. Buyer's paying me 3%, you're paying me 2.5%. Seller, will you pay me the additional 0.5%? So that's what this is about, and that's only when this is used.
It's confusing. I screwed it up yesterday.
Yeah.
Because I wrote it up for yesterday and Stephanie picked it up. And she's like, why did you check it? I'm like, because I want to get paid.
Yeah.
This isn't the MLS.
Right, yes. The MLS is a contract, offer of compensation. Now, a lot of sellers or a lot of, I think there's probably in the future a trend going to be that sellers aren't going to offer a lot of compensation. They may not even offer any compensation. So that you will have to go to your buyer to be compensated. So it will force everybody to do buyer and broker agreements, but you're seeing less and less sometimes being offered on the MLS. So, you know, you might show somebody that's offering 1.5. Now, if you have that buyer broker agreement that says 2.5, then either the seller asks the seller to pay it. If seller can always say no, then if the seller says no, then buyer has to pay because they've agreed to. So now here's the other thing. And on this form, it on the buyer broker agreement, it states this, that Mr. I offer you, buyer is paying buyer's broker 2.5, seller is paying 3%. What happens to that extra 0.5%? So you can say to Mr. Buyer, if I end up getting more money, I'll give it to you. I'm such a nice guy, I'm going to give it to you. Now you don't have to do that, but that's in the buyer broker agreement. So, but this is only used when there is a difference in the negative from what the buyers agreed to pay you and what the sellers agreed to pay you. That's all. Okay, I'm going to stop here at the end. You have a question?
Yeah, just go with, how the buyer is gonna pay the agent? Is it through the postage you?
Through the escrow.
That's where
through
you
the-
maybe charge more for your compensation, 0.5%. maybe $5,000 more and then have that come to the escrow?
Well, this is an agreement prior to the buyer ever goes out and starts looking. It's like, you get this agreement from the buyer when you're contacted by a buyer. And they want to, start looking at properties. So you've negotiated with the buyer. Okay, I'm gonna be compensated, you're gonna compensate me at close of escrow. So that's what you do then, okay? All right, so verification of all cash, so. Most listing agents aren't going to look at an offer that doesn't have the verification attached. I mean, that's just the way it is. But there is a place to say 3 days after acceptance, same as verification of down payment and closing costs, verification of loan application. With the verification of loan application, there are 3 different types of verification of loan application. There's a pre-qualification, which all a pre-qualification is that I filled out an application and the lenders looked at it, and based on what you say is here, yeah, you should qualify for this amount. Pre-approval is I've looked at the documentation, and based on the documentation, you can get this loan. Then there's the full underwritten pre-approval. That means the underwriter, which is the person who really digs deep and says, yes, you have got this loan, basically. So there are some companies that will do a full underwriting, but most times you're going to get a pre-approval. Final verification of condition. It's in the contract that 5 days prior, and it defaults to 5 days prior to close of escrow. You're going to go in and you're going to do a final verification of the condition. Assignment. What's an assignment? An assignment is the contract is written with buyer A. The buyer can always assign this contract to somebody else. Meaning, I'm gonna, now there's a whole new buyer, but under the same contract. Also, if there's a contract written with just a husband, if he later wants to add a wife, that's a partial assignment. So you have 17 days after acceptance that the buyer can request an assignment. It used to be up until the close of escrow. Now it's limited to 17 days. The loan contingency, it defaults to 17 days. Appraisal contingency. Now, there's also check boxes over here that there is no loan appraisal, no loan contingency, no appraisal contingency. And it warns removal of appraisal contingency does not eliminate appraisal cancellation rights in the FVAC. What's that for? An FHA loan and a VA loan, you cannot cancel because it doesn't appraise. You cannot remove the appraisal contingency. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. You cannot remove the appraisal contingency. It remains in place because it's a federally funded loan. So, but then there's this other thing here that appraisal contingency based on appraised value at minimum of purchase price, or there's a little checkbox and then there's a blank there. So a lot of times agents were writing phrases that if it doesn't appraise, but if it appraises for this amount, or it appraises for $10,000 less, then the buyer will move forward. So in order to keep your appraisal contingency, but just have like a safeguard there. So they built it into the contract. So if the purchase price is $450,000, but the buyer has some cash, because if it doesn't appraise, the lender will only loan on the appraised value. So say it appraises for 430. They're gonna only lend up to 430. So in order to get to that 450, the buyer has to add some cash. So they built it into the contract that the buyer is saying that if it appraises at the appraised value at the purchase price or 430, then they'll move forward. So anything 430 and above, they will move forward. If it appraises for 429, they've got an act. Okay. So so that's, any questions on that before I move on? Okay. In investigation of property, 17 days investigation of property, informational access to property. So if the investigation of property, if you lower that to like 10 days, but you still keep the informational access to property to 17 days, that means they have an additional 7 days that they can go in, they can bring their architect, they can bring their measure for drapes or whatever they want to do, flooring or whatever. It's only for informational purposes. It's not a contingency that they can cancel on, but it used to be hidden in the contract. Nobody really knew it was there, and they were trying to limit access to a buyer, saying, oh, you only have 10 days, so you can't come back and look at it. But there was this little hidden gem over here that they had additional time. Review of seller's documents. So seller has to give us disclosures. The buyer has 17 days after acceptance to review those documents, or 5 days after delivery, whichever is later. So if on day 16 you suddenly get documents, you've got 5 days to look at it. So, okay. Preliminary title report, it's the same thing, 17 days or 5 days after delivery. Once again, these are default, they can always be changed. Common interest documents, that's an HOA documents. 17 days to look at them. Usually you don't get them until the 17th day. So review of leased or liened items, solar panels sometimes are leased, water softeners, stuff like that. Anything that's leased, then you've got 17 days to look at it. Sale of buyer's property. So if the buyer has to sell their property in order to get into this property, then there's an added form, the COP, which I've taught separately. So that means it's contingent. This purchase is contingent on the buyer selling their property. So that's the sale of buyer's property. Time of possession. It used to be 6 o'clock on the date of recording. Well, they've changed it upon notice of recording, because most listing agents, once it's recorded, then hey, it's yours. You might as well take the keys. But previously, when it was a contentious transaction, those agents would probably say, according to the contract, it's 6 o'clock. I'm not handing over the keys until 6 o'clock. So anyways, so now it's at the time of recordation. So, and then seller occupied or vacant units. So if the seller is renting back, it all depends on how long they're renting it back. So if it's 29 days or less, there's an additional form called the SIP, seller in possession. If it is 30 days or more, it's an RLAS, residential lease after sale. Why is that? Because 30 days triggers, it is a lease. And most lenders don't want the seller to rent back more than 30 days or more than 29 days, really. So anyways, make sure you get those forms right, because SIP, the 29 or less, it's not a lease, it's not a rent back, really. It is a license to stay in the property. Occupied units by tenants. If there is a tenant occupied in any of, if it's a duplex, if it's a single family home and it's occupied by a tenant, you must use this form called the TOPA, TOPA. So if you check these boxes, it automatically generates these forms. So if it's tenant occupied, then you must use these forms. Seller, okay, so the seller delivery of documents. The seller has 7 days to deliver after acceptance. So 7 days. That's the title, that's disclosures, that's all of that. They're on a time, everything is, time is of the essence. That's the basis of all contracts. Time is of the essence. So you need to be on this transaction, know your timeline, know when, whatever side, doesn't matter what side you're representing. Even if you're representing the seller, you need to know the timeline of the buyer. If you're representing the buyer, you need to know the timeline of the seller, and you need to keep, hold their feet to the fire, saying, I need these documents, because I can't, my buyer can't remove contingencies until he has all this stuff. So know the timelines. Know, what I used to do is in my calendar, I would, this is the date of acceptance. Okay, this property, seller to seller documents, 7 days. Then I go 17 days, buyer to remove this, blah blah blah. Go all the way down the line. Sign and return escrow holder provisions and instructions. People sit on this paperwork for some reason, I don't know why, but buyers, once they get the escrow instructions and everything, they need to return that stuff really fast. So they have 5 days to do it once they get it. So because part of escrow's job is to make sure that the person who says they're selling and the person who says they're buying are actually the people, the actual people that can buy or sell. And you're talking about the right people. So they've got to do they've got some background checking to do. I mean, it's not a full background check, but time to pay fees for ordering HOA documents, 3 days. Seller has 3 days to pay the fees. If I was a listing agent, you're going to need the, and it's a good market, a hot market. When you take the listing, I would put them in touch with escrow and say, hey, let's have the HOA documents ready to go, and pay for them. Install smoke alarms, carbon monoxide detectors, and water heater bracing. Those are required by law by the state of California, that you have smoke alarms, you have a carbon monoxide detector, and your water heater is braced. Most listing agents it's called, in LA, it's called retrofitting. And most listing agents in the Los Angeles area, wait until the final contingencies, all contingencies are removed. That's too late. 7 days for the contract. It has to be done by the 7th day after acceptance. So get that retrofitting done. Make sure that the smoke alarms are there, or the carbon monoxide. If you're a listing agent, because those need to be there when it's appraised, especially the carbon monoxide, they're going to look for a carbon monoxide detector. As a listing agent, they're 10, 20 bucks. Have a bunch of them in your car that it's like, you know, you can stick them in, they come with sticky stuff, and stick it on the wall before the appraiser gets there. You know, if it's not there, obviously. If it's there, you don't have to do anything. But there have to be one on each floor. Smoke detectors outside of each bedroom. So know what needs to be done, and obviously the water heater bracing. So make sure that this stuff is done. Evidence of representative authority. What's representative authority? Representative authority is if the buyer or the seller is an entity. What's an entity? It's a trust, it's a power of attorney, it's a conservatorship, it's a corporation. So those are all entities. An entity can't sign a document. A person, an authorized signer of that entity, can sign a document. So so evidence of that is a copy of the trust, a copy of the letters, the articles of incorporation, copy of the power of attorney. You have probate stuff. That's evidence of a representative authority. So before moving on to the next page, any questions? No. Okay. So items excluded. Just you're checking off what's excluded or included. I'm sorry. First is included. So what is included? What does the buyer want included? Make sure you check everything off that they want included. And excluded items, if it's in the MLS, it doesn't make it to the contract. If there are items in the MLS that are excluded, that your buyer doesn't care about, make sure that they're in this agreement. Or if you're a listing agent, make sure that they're in a counter if they're not in this agreement, because just because it's written in the MLS is not a contract. This is the contract. So make sure that all that is there. Here's the allocation of costs. We're talking about who's going to pay for what. The natural hazard zone disclosure report, the NHD report. So it's customary that the seller here in Southern California, that the seller pays for this, but it's negotiable. So the NHD, the smoke alarms, all of this government required point of sale inspections and reports. That this is the retrofit inspection because for the water heater and the smoke detectors and all of that. And it's also the reports is in Los Angeles. They have what's called a 9A report. We don't waive either of these. The only time I will waive a retrofit inspection in Los Angeles is that if it literally is going to be torn down and it looks like a tear down. I've had agents send me pictures and I said, that's not a tear down. That somebody can change their mind and rent that. And there's liability. And here's the problem. Here's the problem with waiving this smoke detector. I will never waive it if the seller is living in it presently, number one. Because something can happen, close of escrow, and if there's a rent back, then this wasn't done, there's tremendous liability. Also, if it doesn't look like a tear down, then the buyer can say, oh, I'm not ready. It's gonna take the city 6 months to do my plans and blah, 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 blah. And so I'm gonna rent it out in the meantime, and then once again, something happens, there's tremendous liability. So there is liability for you and the buyer and or the seller. So it's doesn't cost that much. We just need to have this done. I'm going to tell you a story about reports. There was an agent in one of my offices who was selling in an area, the city of Bell, that they weren't familiar with. Bell has a pre-inspection report that needs to be done. It's right here that on the counter, the seller removed this item from the contract. Now, my agent who was representing the buyer, not aware of these pre-inspection things. And everybody and the buyer even waived their inspections. It was a fixer-upper. Come to find out, the city now is fining the buyer because this wasn't done. And because it wasn't done to permits, now he wants a whole new brand new house. He wants all this money. So number one, if you're selling in an area you're not familiar with, make yourself familiar with it or refer it out, because it's not worth, I don't know where this is going. It's in the insurance hands for now, but my guess is this buyer is going to get a lot of money. And it's going to cost the agent money too, because there is a deductible. And agents, you're responsible for the deductible per your split with the company. So the majority of that cost is on you. And in this office, it's $25,000. So that's the deductible. So
Wow.
yes, most offices are $25,000 deductible. I've seen even higher. So because everybody sues everybody in California. So that's the state we live in. So anyways, don't do it. Don't waive inspections, don't waive reports, don't do that. And there are the next line, governmental required corrective and remedial actions. So corrective actions is that there is this inspection, this pre-inspection, which they would have found these violations. Who's going to pay for those violations? So that's what that's about. Escrow fee. Each pay I usually put each pay their own. I don't do 50-50 because a lot of people do 50-50 because it really isn't 50-50. Somebody ends up paying more. So buyer pay your fees, seller pay yours. Title insurance. Usually that goes to the seller. County transfer tax. Where are we? No, here we go. County transfer tax, city transfer tax, all negotiable, but historically the seller has paid for those. ULA, that was just passed, $5 million and more. There is a tremendous tax that is put on sales of properties, $5 million and more. I think it's like some ridiculous amount. I mean, it's insane.
4% of that.
I think it's 5. I think it is 5. I have in my head 5%. So yeah. Yeah, exactly. Right. So so that's a lot of money. HOA transfer fees, private transfer fees. You don't know if there's a private transfer fee until it comes up. It usually will show up on a lien. just to be safe, I always would check that the seller is gonna pay for private transfer fees if applicable. If it applies, then the seller will pay for it. Then you can add some other costs, fees and costs here.
What would be examples of those?
A private trend, well, it's in. It usually happens in like new developments where they built the infrastructure. And so they put on a fee to anybody moving into that
Okay,
to help pay for that stuff.
okay, like upgrade.
Yeah, exactly. So, so then you can put in extra fees here. Don't put in home inspection report, buyer to pay for home inspection report. Why? Because the minute it's on this document, the lender is going to want to see it, and you don't want the lender to see a home inspection report because they see everything that's wrong with the property. Also, don't put in termite, that the seller is going to pay for a termite report. Termite, once again, once it's in here, the lender is going to want to see it, and if the termite report is in the contract, then the lender is going to want to see a clearance. So you give away your buyer's rights to take money to do the repairs themselves, and do it at their own pace. Or say there's a deck that needs to be repaired because of termite or dry rot, and if you put it in the RPA, then it has to be done in order for it to be cleared. When your buyer maybe was planning on demolishing the deck all along. So now somebody's going to have to pay for a repair that really isn't necessary. So don't termite any kinds of inspection reports. I'm sorry?
Septic tank?
Septic, that's a different form. There's a whole different form dealing with septic, yeah. So yes, that's but don't put those things there. Home warranty plan, it's self-explanatory. You used to have to put what exactly you want, just put a dollar amount and then they'll deal with that. Other terms, what could go here? Well, if you are related, if somebody is related to, if you're related to the buyer, then that information would go here. You have to disclose if you're related. You have to disclose if you are becoming a principal, if you're going to get a principal, if you get an interest in the property. If you're buying this for yourself, or you're part of it, you're buying part of it for yourself. If you as the buyer have a real estate agent, if your client has a real estate license, if they have a real estate license, you need to disclose it, even if it's expired, because the theory is that somebody with a real estate license has more knowledge than somebody who doesn't. So everybody thinks they're going to get something over on somebody. So just when in doubt, disclose. Any questions on that page before moving?
If your client is your friend, you have to put it.
Well, a friendship is not, it's relative, it's related. If it's your cousin, I mean, we all represent friends.
Right.
I mean, that's not nothing to be disclosed, but if you're related, then yes, that needs to be disclosed. All right, addenda. So here is the TOPA. If it's tenant occupied, if it's a probate, then a probate addendum needs to go here. Manufactured home, mobile home, that needs to go. Tenant in common, stock cooperative, there still are co-ops. They're very rare. The only one that I know of is in Sherman Oaks, a co-op. And a co-op is that you own a share in the whole property. A condominium is you own walls in, and then there's common areas. But a co-op is you own a share in the total property. So it's very rare and it's hard to get financing, but there are places who do finance. Mixed use, if mixed use is a part residential, part retail or something else. Other addendum. if it's a short sale, court confirmation, here's the septic and, septic property monument and propane addendum, buyer intent to exchange. If if the buyer is doing a 1031 exchange, you should use that form. Seller intent to exchange. Also, you should be adding the affiliated business addendum. What businesses we are affiliated with. So if you're representing a buyer and you're asking the seller to use NHD, my NHD, we have an affiliated business with my NHD. You need to disclose that. We have an affiliated business with Home Financial and other lenders and whatnot. You need to disclose that. Old Republic, we have an affiliated business with. So that needs to be disclosed, and that they're disclosed on that form, and we should be disclosing that at the time of the offer. Okay, so that's we've now done everything that needs to be filled out. Now we get into the explanations. So it's the initial, what's the explanation for initial deposit? The explanation for the increased deposit, retention of deposit. This is important to go over with your buyer, is that parties or otherwise incorporated into the screen specifies a remedy for buyer's default. Buyer and seller are advised to consult with a qualified California real estate attorney before adding any clause specifying a remedy such as release or forfeiture of deposit, making a deposit non-refundable. A lot of people are, when it was a really hot, market, they were saying upon acceptance, buyer's deposit is non-refundable. And there's issues with that. There's issues with making something non-refundable. It's possible it can not be enforceable. Meaning the buyer can come back and say, oh, I didn't know what that meant. I didn't mean to do that. And end up getting their money back. The only time that really works to make release of deposit non-refundable is if there's something in exchange for that. So you're in a contract and they're dragging their heels. They're not getting the loan approval. The lender wants 15 more documents, whatever it is, and they want more time. Okay, Mr. Buyer, I'll give you more time, but you need to give me some money, and it's my money. You can't get it back. That is enforceable, is that you're getting something in exchange for me getting something. It's quid pro quo. So that is the way to do it, is if you're asking for something, if you're getting something in return, then you can do that. So that's that. All cash offer, we all know that okay, an all cash offer is that, an all cash offer. No loan is needed. This agreement is not contingent on the buyer getting a loan, but you're going to see something a little later. Limits on credits to buyer. I said make your lender your friend because there are limits on credits. On a $450,000 property, coming back with a credit of $100,000 because so much is wrong with this property. Guess what? The lender isn't going to approve $100,000 on a $450,000. They're not going to allow that to happen. Usually it's between 3% and 6%. So you should have a conversation with your lender as to what the limit is on this particular loan, because it may, different loans have different limits. So, and if you agree to a credit that the lender isn't going to allow, guess what's gonna happen? The buyer's gonna come after you. Because you said, you let me do it, you said I could get it, you asked for it, it's all you, I want the extra $20,000 that I'm not getting now, so. So always know what that limit is. Verification of down payment, though, those are pretty self-explanatory. Buyer stated financing. Okay, so it's a cash deal. So seller is relying on buyer's representation of the type of financing specified. So all cash, even the amount of the down payment. You know, seller has agreed to a specific closing date, purchase price, and to sell the buyer in reliance on the buyer's specified financing. Buyer shall pursue the financing specified in the agreement, even if the buyer also elects to pursue an alternative form of financing. So what happens a lot is that the buyer says, I'm gonna go all cash. He shows you that he has all cash. But I'm gonna look at a loan. They have every right to do that. They can look at alternate financing. But the seller is relying on what you told me you were gonna do. And I agree to a timeline, I agree to all of this stuff based on what you told me to do. So what the seller doesn't have to do is the seller doesn't have to cooperate with the buyer to pursue this alternate thing. So if it's going to take longer, seller doesn't have to do it. If they want to do an appraisal, seller really doesn't have to allow that to happen, because that involves this allowing somebody into their home. Now, is it really a problem for the seller to let somebody in the home to do an appraisal? Not really. I would probably advise the seller to go ahead and let them do the appraisal. It's just that we're going to hold everything else. That, you know, they're not going to be able to, you know, to extend the close of escrow. They can't do any of that. You know, if they can't get this loan in time, then they're just going to have to close with cash. But the seller doesn't have to cooperate. Occupancy, that's pretty self-explanatory. Condition of property upon closing. So that's the final. Okay, there's a couple of things here. The property shall be delivered as is in present physical condition. As is. So this 7B1. Every property in the state of California is sold as an as-is sale. That means all these listing agents who write in, its property is sold as is, but the seller will not do any repairs or give any credits, blah, blah, blah. That's all well and good. You know, if they want to waste ink, they can waste ink. But this was brought up in CAR meetings that I was just in. The problem that arises from this, putting this listing agents, putting this in a counter, is that it gives the impression to the seller that the buyer doesn't have any right to ask for any credits, to ask for anything to be repaired. So then the seller can cancel based on that. And that's a problem because they don't have that right. The seller cannot cancel just because, just because the buyer wants to ask for something to be repaired or wants a credit, just because it was in a counter. So if you're a listing agent and your seller insists on you putting that in, you can put that in, but you need to make sure that they are aware that the buyer has every right still to do the inspections, as long as the investigation contingency is there, and to ask for things. You can always say no. And as a matter of fact, you don't even have to respond to a request for repair. Your response can be a notice to perform to remove the contingency. So that's my lecture on as is. Everything is sold as is. So also, I think it goes into this later, but I'll mention it here, is that final verification of property. That's what final verification of property is. It is to ensure that the property is in the same condition as when the offer was initially made. That when they made the offer, the seller didn't go in and remove all the kitchen cabinets or do something to the property to change the property as to the condition. And also that if the seller agreed to any repairs, that those repairs were done. So that's why you want to make sure that you time your verification of property, that if there were repairs to be done, that it gives them time to do it and to make sure that it's in that same condition. It is not a condition, it is not a contingency to cancel. If something was done, if there was repairs that were supposed to be done that weren't done, you can't stop the close of escrow. The buyer's only remedy is small claims court. So, I mean, you could possibly sneak around. It's a dance, is to schedule it, giving them enough time to do the work, but also enough time prior to your signing the loan docs. So you can delay signing the loan docs, and there's some leverage there, but ultimately the seller can give a demand to close, and then you're putting the buyer's deposit at risk. Because if the buyer defaults, then the seller possibly has a right to the deposit. This talks about seller remaining in possession after close of escrow. There's that form, those two forms, depending on the time frame. Loan contingency, we went over appraisal contingency, investigation of property, that's the final verification, review of seller demand, title. I'll say this about the title report. Absolutely look over the title report, but don't answer questions for your client about what's in the title report. Always refer them to your title rep. You don't want to be the person who is giving this information, because in case that there is something wrong, that they don't point the finger at you, they point the finger at somebody else. So, and that's what title's job is. Talks about reviewing lease or lien items, removal or waiver of contingent. Seller shall have no obligation to remove a contractual contingency unless, buyer shall have no obligation to remove a contractual contingency unless seller has provided all required documents, reports, disclosures, and information pertaining to that contingency. So if you haven't gotten the HOA docs, you can't remove, there's agents who say you have to, here's the removal of all contingency, your buyer needs to sign it. No, I don't have this information. I need this information before I can sign it. Now, there's still agents who want to argue with you about that, but if buyer removes or waives any contingency without an adequate understanding of the property's condition or buyer's ability to purchase, buyer is acting against the advice of the agent. So always get in writing an instruction from your buyer as are you ready to remove this? Are you sure? Get it in writing. You want something in writing from a lender saying is loan approved. Don't say we have to we have until today to remove it, we've got to remove it, don't say that. You know, unless you're given a notice to perform, which you have 2 days to perform. Then there is no pressure to remove a contingency, it doesn't go away. This is an active contract. There are contracts in other states that are passive, meaning that if there's 17 days of a contingency, then on that 17th, on the 18th day, that contingency is gone. It's just gone. You're out of time. But this is active, it has to be removed in writing. This has been doing this, I've been here for 6 years, it's been doing this all this time. Okay, it talks about items included and excluded, leased items, items excluded. Down here, usually the bold things, and that is, you know, if it's attached to a wall, then like a bracket attached to walls, floors, for any furniture or whatever will be removed, and the holes and other damage shall be repaired but not painted. That's how we deal with like TV things, you know, mounts, and what they're removed and patched, and that's it. Inspection report, it talks about government required inspections and reports, point of sale requirements. You know, also part of retrofitting is, you know, if it's an older home and it doesn't have an earthquake valve, that's a requirement in the city of Los Angeles that an earthquake valve be put on property. When this comes back, okay. Reinspection fees. Remember, I told you that they're going to want to see the smoke detector or the carbon monoxide detector appraisers. And if it's not there, some appraisers will say, well, we'll have to do a reinspection, and there will be a fee. They're allowed to charge a fee to come back out. And this is saying that cost, it's the seller's responsibility because it should have been there when this was done. It talks about statutory requirements. The TDS transfer, the transfer disclosure statement, the NHD statement, natural hazard disclosure statement, lead-based paint if it's before 78, the appraisal fairness, which is attached to this, is a statutory requirement. Fire hardening and defensible space, if it's in a high or very high fire zone, is a statutory requirement. So those are all statutory requirements, meaning that they are required by law and they cannot be waived. Now, included is the SPQ, which is not required by law, but it's required as it's a contractual, it's in here as a contractual obligation, which seller, if they wanted, could counter it out. They could not counter out a TDS if they're not exempt. So, so this talks about lead and home defensible space, waiver prohibitive, meaning you can't waive this, return of signed copies within 5 days, termination rights. If you don't do these statutory requirements, like a TDS, and the TDS on the listing side is not complete until the avid is attached, and so many listing agents wait until the final walkthrough in order to, or the inspection to do their avid. So if you've given the disclosure, the TDS, without the listing agent's avid, it's not complete. So that means even if the buyer removed their contingencies for seller disclosures, the minute that avid gets sent to the buyer, you've given them an out. They don't like something that you say they see in your avid, then they have a termination right for 5 days. They can rescind that sale. So same with the defensible space, the fire hardening. If the seller doesn't do it right. Well, if the seller doesn't do it or doesn't disclose something specific, and then they're given something subsequently corrected, then they can cancel, they can terminate. Withholding taxes, if it is a foreign national that is selling, it's the buyer's obligation to withhold 10% of the proceeds, the buyer's obligation. So make sure that if it is a foreign national on the seller side, that escrow is aware, they're doing everything that they have, because ultimately the buyer is on the hook for that. Okay. Megan's Law. Okay, Megan's Law. There's a website to direct clients to. Same with the pipelines. That stems from a gas explosion up in Carpinteria, I think it was. And then once again, the natural and environmental hazards. Talks about condominiums, solar panels, and what known material facts. Seller shall disclose known material facts. If you're representing a seller, make sure you're telling them disclose. Well, I don't want, the foundation has a crack in it, but it's not bad. Disclose it.
Not that.
Because you know what I call you, Mr. Seller? A litigant, because you will be sued once they find this out. And you as the agent now have been put on notice that this is there, and you have an obligation to disclose it. So okay, what are we doing? Okay. This talks about buyer, you need to do your investigations. Title investing, we don't tell buyers how to take vesting. They should talk to their tax people. Vesting is how they take title. Time periods is very important. Time period, once again, time is of the essence. So they need to do everything in a timely manner. Once again, contingencies are not removed unless they're removed in writing. Okay, and then if there's a contingency in place and the buyer is acting in good faith and they don't want to proceed, they can cancel because of that contingency. If there's a problem in the inspection, there's something they don't like in the inspection, then they can cancel because of the investigative contingency. So and it's not only the physical aspects of the property, it could be the neighborhood. When I bought my first house, we went around to the neighborhood, knocked on people's doors, and hey, what do you think of the neighborhood? We're thinking of moving in. You meet your new neighbors, you get it. Neighbors will tell you everything about Gladys Kravitz. If you don't know who Gladys Kravitz was a character in Bewitched. She was the nosy neighbor. She knew everything about that went on in that neighborhood. And so that's the best way. Advise your buyer to ask. Go and ask, talk to their neighbors. Also, drive by at different times. We look at houses mostly during the day. It could be a different environment at night. So And those are all factors. It's not just, whether the plumbing works. So, yeah. Seller's right to cancel. If you're representing a seller, really important. The minute that you're sitting down with your seller in order to accept an offer, Mr. Seller, you accept this offer. The only reason you can cancel is if the buyer does not perform. You are stuck with this person. This is your buyer. They piss you off in the future, they won't ask for too many repairs, whatnot. If they perform, you have to sell it to them. So make sure that they are aware that that's the only reason that they can cancel, is if the buyer doesn't perform. But if the buyer ultimately performs, they're the new owner of that house. So that is make sure that your sellers understand that, because so many sellers just think, I just changed my mind, I don't want to sell it. You can't do that. You cannot do that. This is a contract. But you should also always say, a seller who says that, you need to consult your own attorney as to what your options are. I'm not an attorney, I can't advise you on that, but according to the contract, it looks like the only way you can cancel is if they're not performing, and they are performing. Now, as I said, the buyer has a right to cancel if something is wrong, they don't like something in the title report, they're not getting the seller's documents, any of those reasons. The buyer has all the outs, the seller does not. And removal of buyer's contingencies. Once they've removed the contingency, there's no going back. There's no going, I thought about that a little more, and it still does, it bothers me, and I want to cancel now because of that. And it's like, that ship has sailed. You've got to move forward. So if all contingencies are removed and somebody's not closing, you need to give a demand to close. Now, previously, if they're not removing contingencies, they're not doing what they're contractually obligated to do, you give them a notice to perform, which has 2 days, gives them 2 days to perform. A demand to close escrow is 3 days. They have 3 days. So, and it can't be given more than 3 days prior to the scheduled close of escrow date. If you, the seller, know that the buyer is, dragging their feet and it doesn't look like they're going to close, the seller, 3 days prior to that close of escrow date, can give a demand to close. Now, this doesn't, giving a notice to perform and giving a demand to close doesn't mean that they have to cancel. It only means that they have the right to cancel. Because a lot of times agents will wait, and it's supposed to close on Wednesday, and they wait until Wednesday to give the notice to demand to close, and then they've lost those 3 days. So now you have to wait another 3 days. Well, then it goes into a weekend. Then you have to go wait until, it can't end on a weekend. And so, it's only protecting your client's rights by giving either the notice to perform or the demand to close it prior to those events happening. So 2 days prior to a contingency being up, you can give a notice to perform. 3 days prior to the close of escrow, scheduled close of escrow, you can give a demand to close. Very important, effect of cancellation on deposits. If buyer or seller gives written notice of cancellation under the terms of the agreement, the parties agree to sign and deliver mutual instructions to cancel the sale to escrow and release deposits to the party entitled to the funds, less fees or costs to the escrow holder. So basically, you don't get your money back unless both of you agree. That's right. That's basically it. The contract can be, there's two parts to a cancellation of contract. The first part is canceling the contract. Who's canceling and what's the reason they're canceling? The second part is what do we do with the deposit? The minute that you cancel, if somebody cancels and has a right to cancel, the buyer cancels because of inspections or whatever, and they have the right to cancel, that contract is canceled. But then we go to the other part as to what happens to the deposit. And if both parties don't agree as to what's going to happen to the deposit sits in escrow until mediation. First mediation, that's it. Then arbitration if they've agreed to arbitration. So that's it isn't that suddenly, number one, if the buyer defaults, that the seller automatically gets that money. If the buyer doesn't agree to release that money, which most buyers are not, then the seller's got to spend some money, and mediation costs a few $100. So there's costs involved. Repairs. This talks about repairs. You know, you have a right to ask for repairs, but you're not necessarily going to get them. Final verification we've talked about. Prorations of property taxes and other items. It's important to tell your buyers you're being, through escrow, you're paying the taxes based on what the seller paid. Once the city gets caught up, you're going to get another bill. So don't think that you're paid up and ignore something that comes later. You have to give them a heads up that they will get a prorated bill or a supplemental tax bill in the future based on what they paid for them. Because if the seller paid $300,000 for this property, they are being taxed, you know, works out to like 1.25. They're paying, that's their property tax. You're paying $1 million.
Right. Yeah.
Your taxes are way more. So, but it's still cheaper than other states. So just make sure that they're aware of that, because I've had clients who ignore the supplemental tax bill and then are surprised when they threaten threaten all these fees and all this stuff. So just be aware of that. This talks about our compensation as brokers. Remember, brokers, the buying and the selling agents are not a party to this contract. This is between a buyer and the seller. Those are the only initials, those are the only people that sign on this. So we are not a party to this. That's why nothing about a compensation commission, no terms about commission go in the contract, except for that little bit of amount that says, Mr. Seller, will you pay what the buyer is not paying? So, but other than that, nothing about commission goes in this. Escrow instructions, it basically says that escrow holder is going to take this document and make it into escrow instructions. And remember, acceptance is after everybody has signed. If we're still waiting for one seller to sign, it hasn't been accepted. This talks about MLS, assignment and nomination. This used to only be assignment, and then people were saying, well, I'm nominating. Basically, this is saying they're one and the same thing, and you only have X amount of days to do it. After 17 days, a buyer can still ask to assign it to somebody else, but the seller at that point doesn't have to agree. So then there's all these definitions of as is, the agreement, close of it. A great thing about counting days, because it's confusing about counting days when you're dealing with with a notice to perform. It cannot end on a weekend or a holiday. So an action cannot end on a weekend and a holiday. So if you give a notice to perform on Thursday, day one is day one is Friday, day two is Saturday, but it can't end. So Monday, you have to give them Monday to perform. So the Tuesday, the seller would be able to cancel, or the buyer would be able to cancel, depending on who. And it doesn't matter what time of day you deliver it. It is a day. So it goes from midnight to 11:59 p.m. So
So the day of delivery is 0 day.
yes,
Okay.
yeah. And then delivery, if there is a designated email address on the last page of this document, then when you send it by email, it's delivered. End of story. It used to be you had to prove that it was delivered. So that doesn't hold water anymore. Terms and conditions. This is, as Judge Judy says, the agreement is the four corners of this document. Time is of the essence. We talked about that. Legally authorized signer. That's talking about entities, which we went over. Liquidated damages. Liquidated damages. This is why if it's owner occupied, if it's the primary residence, owner occupied, you want 3% down. Seller wants 3% down for liquidated damages, meaning that it's limiting the damages to the 3%. Now, if it's not owner occupied and somebody puts more than 3% down, then that whole amount is at jeopardy as a default. So, like if somebody puts 50% down on an investment property, then they default, then that whole 50% becomes
Ugly.
exactly. So these are optional. We cannot advise buyers on whether or sellers to initial. They need to consult their own attorney, but we can say that normally parties do initial liquidated damages, limiting the amount of and then we go to mediation. That is the first line of defense, is everybody goes to mediation. If you don't go to mediation and then you just go to a lawsuit, then you cannot get attorney's fees. So it pays to mediate. Arbitration is, you're before a retired judge, a retired real estate attorney, and he decides, he's given all the evidence, and he or she decides who is right and what the award is. So arbitration is binding if both parties initial it. You can say that most people do initiate initial arbitration because it tends to be faster. A lawsuit can take anywhere from several years in order to see the light of day. Okay, we're almost there. Okay, so buyer's offer. This is where they sign. Now, if they are an entity buyer, meaning if they are a trust, you used to have to fill out a whole nother form. They've made it so all you have to do is check it here. It is an entity buyer. So that means it's a trust, a corporation, LLC, probate, any of these things. The agreement is being signed by the legally authorized signer. The name of the legal authorized signer is or are. So if in the case of a trust, it would be John Doe trustee. So that's the name of the legally authorized signer, or a POA, John Doe, POA for Jane Doe. That's the legally authorized signer. corporation, John Doe, authorized signer or managing director or whatever his title is. So that goes there, the name of the person who is signing. Then down here, the name of the entity. So John Doe Trust, you know, John Doe Estate, if it's probate, you know, ABC Corporation, you know, that goes there. And then it's signed. And if it is a legally authorized signer, then you check it and their title, you know, John Doe Trustee. Otherwise, if it's just a regular buyer, then John Doe. And then the seller has the option of just accepting, doing a counter offer, or if it's a backup offer, checking it's a backup offer. And once again, if the seller is an entity, then then you fill this out exactly as you did above. So that's that. So I want to get, this is the last thing I'm going to cover, is that real estate brokers section. Couple of things here. Presentation of offer. NAR, standard of practice 1.7. If buyer agent makes a written request to the seller's agent, whether the offer was presented, the seller's agent shall confirm in writing that this offer has been presented. That's all they need to do. They send you an email saying, was my offer presented? My buyer's offer is presented. Then the listing agent says, yes, your offer was in. Responds in writing, yes, the offer was in. They don't have to return this, mark it, reject it. They don't have to do that. Anybody who tells you that is wrong. What you want to fill out on both sides is designated electronic delivery address. So on if you're presenting the offer, what email address are you going to say, if it's sent to this address, then it's delivered? And then the same with the seller's information, put in this listing agent's email address. Because you don't want it going back to the old way, in that you have to prove that they got it. Prove it. This way, if you emailed it to them, then it was sent and received. Also, I thought of something that went in my head and it totally went out. Anyways, okay, so escrow holder acknowledgement, the escrow holder fills that out. Presentation of offer, you can do that if you want, you don't have to, like I said. And then that is the RPA. Then it goes into buyer investigation. Any questions? I know it's a long class, but anybody? Bueller? Okay. So where do we go? All right. Well, I thank you for showing up, and I know that everybody's pissed off at me because yeah, exactly. Wait, I have to find, where are you? Where's the recording? No, that's stop video. Where's the recording? Oh, stop.